Hello and welcome to my channel Linux World. In today's video we are going to talk about creating pods and containers with the local accounts. So far we have been in the Podman series, we have been working with the root account, which is not a good practice. One of the benefits of using Podman is you can run it with a local account without having any root privileges. So let's see that in action. So I'm logged into my system host machine, which is hosting my containers and pods, test VM00. And let's create a user add. Let's call it a pod user 01. Okay, pod user 01. Okay, we're gonna give it a password. Pod user 01. Okay. Password is, the command is different. Pod user 01. Keep messing up. Password. Okay. Okay, so if I do ID pod user 01, it exists on my system now with the UID of 1002 and the same as for the GID. And we have given it a password. Now, if I check the sudo rules for this user, like so, sudo -l-u, capital U, pod user 01, it shows that pod user 01 is not allowed to run any sudo commands on test VM00. So it doesn't have super user do commands on the system. It does not have administrative rights on the system, but it can run your containers. That's one of the benefits of Podman. So we will exit out of the system. We are now logged in as root. This hash sign also identifies that, or you can run ID by itself. It tells you that you're root. So, or you can do who am I? I am root. Okay. So we will log back in with the new user account that we created, pod user 01. Okay, at test VM00. Provide a password for the new user account. There you go. So I am logged in and my home directory is /home/pod user 01. That's my present working directory. PWD will show me that. And all the accounts that you create on Red Hat Linux, their home directory will be under /home. Okay. And it will be created with the user's name. So I am under /home and pod user 01. And in my directory, I have nothing. Okay. So let's run podman images. We don't have any images. But as root account, we created, if you remember in the last videos, that we have created some images. We have created containers, we have created pods. But now I'm logged in as a different user. He does not have that. So let's create, let's fetch an image. Podman pull CentOS stream 9 for pod user 01. Okay. Let that finish. Okay. So now if I run Podman images, it shows me that I have a image downloaded to my system, to myself, as a user Podman 01. Okay. And another thing to check here is if you do an ls-la to see your hidden directories, it created a hidden directory here called .local. Okay, this directory contains all the container information for this particular user. So it's not shared with the system. It's stored locally on the user's home directory. So this is like your own space, the user's own space. And whatever the user does with the containers as a developer, it's under his own home directory. This is his own. So if I do ls local and share, you can see all the container information is here, cache storage and stuff like that. So that's one of the things to note, that if you're running Podman as a user, as your own self user, then it will store the container information in your local home directory. Okay, now let's do Podman pod create. We're gonna create a pod and map it. Actually, we're going to create a pod. We already looked at how to create pods in the previous video. So we create a pod, Podman, spell that right, pod, and pod create, and map the port 8089 to port 80, and call it test pod. Podman pod ls will show us that we have created a test pod and has one container, which is the pause container. So we do podman ps will show us -a that it created this pause container. Okay, it's not running right now, it's just created. So when you create a pod, we know that it creates a pause container, which is going to handle the communication between the containers inside a pod. So now the next thing we're going to do is create a container inside this pod. Podman run -d -p. Okay, let's do at -p. One thing I want to know, that the port mapping when you run Podman with a local account, you have to use a port that is above 1024. Okay, and you can map it to the container port 80. For instance, you're trying to map a port 80 of the container to the host port. You have to make sure you don't use any of the ports up until 1024, because those are reserved for privileged users like root and stuff. So to check this, we can try 1023, right, and map it to port 80 for this new container I'm creating, and run it from CentOS stream 9 image, and it will give you some kind of error. It says error, rootless support cannot expose privileged port. It's a privileged port stored for a root user, so it has to be higher. So we use it a very high number anyway. So I was just trying to set it out there, but we don't have to, since we already created a pod, but we're not creating this container inside a pod. We're just creating it by itself. So let's just do that. Let's expose port 8090. I think we gave the 8089 to the pod, and 8090 to this container. And let's run this. And if we do podman ps, you can see that a container is running. Okay, so we could like the user root has its own images and it's running its own container. You can add another user account, user add SSH test user. I'm going to log in as root user on the test VM. Okay, and create another user as root. I can do that, right? User add pod user 02. Okay, user 02. Give it a password, and now log out. Now I will use this second user, pod user 02, and test VM00. Give my password, and if I do sudo -l to list out my privileges. I have to provide my password, and it says, sorry, I don't have any privileges to run. Sorry about that. Run sudo commands on this system. So if I do podman images, again, I don't have any images. So you can have multiple users with their own space running containers on a system for development, and they won't collide. So you can run containers in Podman pods without any root privileges. With Docker, you have to give them sudo privileges and allow them to run some commands as privileged commands, right? And yeah, so this covers this topic. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned.